Hey guys, tonight we drift into the midnight gardens of ancient Persia, where the air smells of rosewater and secrets, where candlelight flickers on silk pillows, and poetry isn't just something you read, it's something you drink, like forbiddens. Wine. You are standing under a pomegranate tree at the edge of Shiraz. The sky above you is black crushed velvet. Somewhere nearby, a nightingale breaks into song, and from a nearby courtyard, laughter and lute music spill into the dark light. Honey, you're not sure who's kissing whom, or who's worshipping whom, but maybe here, in this twilight empire of metaphors, it's the same thing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it by your clock? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge deeper into the Persian night, past tiled fountains and slow-burning lanterns, and you find yourself inside world where mystics moan like lovers, and lovers cry out like prophets. Here, poetry is a currency, more trusted than gold. And desire? It's not a sin exactly, it's a key. You just have to figure out which door it opens. Every word you hear tonight has traveled centuries, smuggled inside velvet books, passed between lovers, scholars, Sufi saints, and spies. Some of these verses were whispered in hammams. Others scratched into palace walls with diamond pins. One or two were probably moaned under silk sheets by someone who claimed to be seeking God, but didn't mind finding something else on the way. Let's be honest, if you were raised with the idea that poetry is a dry school subject, you're about to unlearn that. In medieval Persia, poetry wasn't just entertainment. It was courtship, it was seduction, it was protest, prayer, and foreplay. Imagine Tinder, but with verses. Imagine texting your crush, but the emoji is a rose with 7 meanings, and the punctuation could get you executed. Yeah, that's where you are now, and here's the real kicker. You probably won't survive this. Not all of you anyway. Because something inside you will change. The more you let yourself feel what these poets felt, the less you'll be able to go back to straight lines and safe metaphors. Once you've seen how a single word like wine can mean pleasure, punishment, paradise, and political treason all at once, plain speech just won't cut it anymore. You'll crave the danger, the double meaning, the dizzying little high of words dancing on the edge of blasphemy. Take the poets of this time, not just writers, but vibe curators of the court. They lounged in jasmine-scented salons, drunk on metaphors high on divine suggestion. Some wore Sufi robes, others sported court silks. All of them balanced on the blade-thin line between ecstasy and heresy. The Sufis, those poetic mystics, saw erotic love as a kind of training wheels for divine love. Wanting someone so much it hurts? Good, now aim higher. Want God like that. But here's the twist: half the time, they weren't sure which was which. Neither are you. Imagine Rumi. Yes, that Rumi. The one whose quotes now decorate yoga studios and Whole Foods candles spinning in circles until the world dissolved. Thinking only of Shams, his intense and mysterious muse. Their bond? Still makes scholars sweat. Was it love? Was it a soul-merging divine bromance? Was it romantic? Sexual? Historians still argue whether the depth of Rumi's poetry about Shams is spiritual sublimation or good old-fashioned longing. Either way, you'll meet him soon. Just know that this isn't your grandma's spirituality. This is mystical thirst, Persian edition. And let's not pretend the mystics had a monopoly on this wordplay. Court poets like Hafez, centuries later, took the same themes: longing, love, intoxication, and twisted them into dense little grenades of metaphor. You'll hear them quote God and get drunk in the same stanza. You'll hear them pine for someone whose body they describe with astronomical precision, and yet swear they only mean the divine. Sure you do, buddy. But here's where things get even more intoxicating. These poets weren't just writing for themselves. They were performing in front of sultans, scholars, and sometimes concubines. Yes, sex happened. And no, it wasn't always polite. In fact, it got complicated fast. One poem might be praising the curve of a boy's neck. Another, the scent of a woman's hair. And always you have to ask, is this a lover? Is this God? Is this a clever way to say both without getting beheaded? Tonight, you'll meet a court scribe who fell in lust with a concubine and started writing verses so seductive they ended up carved onto palace mirrors. You'll visit the private library of a Sufi cleric who kept banned texts hidden behind rows of innocent religious commentary, like a divine version of hiding Playboy inside a Bible. And you'll hear how wine became the single most dangerous word in Persian poetry, not because it's booze, but because it's rebellion disguised as ritual. Along the way, we'll follow the tangled curls of lovers' hair, decode the garden metaphors that masked forbidden's passion, and peek inside the few surviving poems by women who dared to turn the mystic male gaze back on itself. You'll hear about a courtesan who quoted the Quran mid-makeout, and a eunuch librarian who may or may not have smuggled love letters inside hollowed-out Qurans. Yes, really. And if you're thinking this is all just poetic fluff, think again. These verses had power. Poets shaped the reputations of kings. One bad couplet could get you exiled. One sexy stanza might win you a new patron or a secret invitation to a bathhouse rendezvous. This was no harmless hobby. This was social climbing, soul-searching, and seduction rolled into one ink-stained game of survival. Even now, centuries later, their words linger. They haunt tattoos, Instagram captions, wedding vows. But most of the world only sees the surface. They don't see the hunger underneath. They don't feel the ache. You will. Because you'll be there, in the hammam, in the garden, on the rooftop with the moon reflecting off a cup of forbidden's wine, reciting verses that sound like prayer but taste like temptation. And that's just the beginning. You press further into the heat-hazed mirage of medieval Persia, and now the air changes. It thickens, turns fragrant, charged with something that feels both sacred and suspicious. You're walking beside a dervish, sandals worn thin, robes patched and swirling like windblown parchment, and he's humming under his breath. Not a song, exactly, a verse. The kind that sounds like it's about a kiss, but leaves you wondering if it's about the soul instead. That's the Sufi trick, and tonight you're going to learn how love, especially the aching kind, became one of their favorite tools for divine mischief. You see, Sufism wasn't just some fringe cult with a few flowery poems. It was a full-blown mystical movement with its own philosophy, rituals, and seriously unorthodox ideas about God. The basic gist? God is too big, too beautiful, too overwhelming to be reached through logic or rules. You want to find him? Burn for him. Long for him like you long for someone who's left your bed still warm. Crave him like you crave the person you can't have. So, in comes the metaphor of the lover. And not just any lover. The beloved, capital B, whose glance breaks your heart, whose absence leaves you ruined, whose silence teaches you more than sermons ever could. And the Sufis leaned all the way into it. Their most revered texts read like diaries of starved romantics. Sleepless nights, trembling hands, kisses imagined or remembered, tears that turn into prayers. And suddenly you get it. You're not supposed to resist desire. You're supposed to ride it straight to heaven. But here's the twist that keeps tripping up modern readers. None of this was cleanly labeled. When a Sufi poet writes about being drunk on the scent of his beloved's hair, is he talking about a woman, a man, God? All three? Historians still argue whether these verses reflect actual romantic entanglements or symbolic ecstasy. And if you're feeling confused, perfect. Confusion is half the point. The Sufis wanted to unhook you from certainty. They believed that longing was the most honest state a human could occupy. The moment you're satisfied, you've stopped searching. But if you're aching, if you're yearning, if your heart feels like it's being played by a harpist who only knows sad songs, then you're right, where you should be. One of the earliest and most influential Sufi thinkers was Rabia of Basra, a woman who lived in the 8th century, long before the Persian poetic golden age hit full throttle. She once said, "I want to drown in love, not just sip at it." This from a woman who turned down marriage proposals like they were moldy dates, preferring instead to write about how she loved God not for heaven's rewards or hell's punishments, but simply for God's own aching beauty. She prayed, "If I worship you for fear of hell, burn me in hell. If I worship you for hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise." That's the kind of love that doesn't blink. Centuries later, Persian Sufis like Adder would take that emotional rawness and lace it with a deep literary elegance. Adder's masterpiece, The Conference of the Birds, is basically a road trip, with peacocks and pigeons where each stop is a metaphor for a spiritual struggle, and every bird represents a human flaw. But buried in the fable is a quietly explosive idea. The divine isn't out there, separate from you. It's in the mirror, in the burning ache, in the breaking open. When the birds finally reach the legendary Simurgh, the mystical king they've been seeking, all they find is their own reflection. And in between all these lofty metaphors, yes, there were flesh and blood stories that got very real. Like the tale of a wandering poet who fell for a young butcher's apprentice, followed him across 3 cities, and wrote dozens of ghazals that slowly morphed from explicit adoration into spiritual surrender. The details come from an 11th century manuscript found in the ruins of Nishapur, and the verses are surprisingly candid. One reads, "Your shoulder blades, a ladder to my undoing. Your silence, a hymn I cannot outsing." By the end, the poet doesn't even name the boy, just calls him my ruin. Was it God by then, or was he still writing about the apprentice? You decide. And let's not forget the fringe tidbits. Did you know that some Sufi orders used controlled breathing and whirling not just as prayer, but to simulate the dizzying rush of falling in love? They believed that ecstasy, both physical and emotional, could short-circuit the ego, melt down the illusion of separation, and leave only divine union behind. That's why the famous whirling dervishes of the Mevlevi order, the followers of Rumi, spun themselves silly. It wasn't performance. It was a method, a theology of motion. They were trying to become the metaphor itself, lovers turning into love. And because we promised at least one sex story per section, here's a gem from Foucault's notes on early Islamic eroticism. A 13th century Sufi master named Nasir, based in Isfahan, reportedly kept a private journal that detailed his attempts to sublimate lust through ritual. Translation: he was trying not to bone, but he also didn't believe in suppression. So he invented what he called the mirror technique. He'd look into a polished metal mirror while meditating on the body of a person he desired, using the reflection to separate form from urge. According to one entry, it worked. According to another, it very much didn't. The mirror cracked. Now, you might be asking, weren't there some clerics who frowned on all this sensual spirituality? Oh yes, plenty. There were fatwas, book burnings, angry sermons warning that the line between mystic poetry and erotic temptation was dangerously thin. But here's the clever thing. The Sufis didn't fight back with arguments. They fought with ambiguity. Their verses could always be explained away. That moan? Oh, that's a metaphor for divine union. That kiss? Purely symbolic. That drunk on wine moment? Totally allegorical. It became a game. A seductive, philosophical, soul-warping game. Poets would push the envelope, then pretend to blush. Readers would raise an eyebrow, then read the verse again. And in between them, like a ghost in the ink, was the beloved never quite named, never quite human, and somehow more real than either of them. You're starting to see the pattern, aren't you? The mystics didn't escape desire. They weaponized it. They stretched it like a canvas and painted God onto it in flesh tones. They made their longing into a ritual. They turned heartbreak into a sacrament. And in doing so, they left behind a poetic tradition that still pulls readers into its orbit. Centuries later, you for instance, you're already caught. You're not even halfway through your pomegranate yet when he appears. Rumi, the name that gets embroidered on bathrobes, dropped into yoga classes, and quoted in wedding vows by people who couldn't tell a gazelle from a grocery list. But forget the fridge magnets for a minute. The real Rumi is about to spin into your life like a desert storm wearing a silk robe. It's the 13th century. You're in Konya, now part of modern-day Turkey, but then a bustling Persianate city soaked in scholarship and smoldering under Mongol pressure. Jalal al-Din Rumi is already a respected scholar, a teacher, a good boy by all accounts. Then one day, a stranger arrives. His name is Shams of Tabriz, and he is electric, wild-eyed, barefoot, reportedly radiant in a way that makes people uncomfortable. Rumi meets him in the street, and something splits. A new universe is born, and its laws don't resemble anything from Rumi's polite, well-ordered world. It's not an overstatement to say Shams breaks Rumi open. What begins as part friendship, part mentorship, part spiritual detonation, and yes, part infatuation so intense it leaves love letters charred into the margins of history. Historians still argue whether the relationship between Rumi and Shams was physical, platonic, or simply mystical. Frankly, the question misses the point. The verses that spill out of Rumi after meeting Shams don't just flirt with longing, they drown in it. You read lines like, "I am a candle, burned by your flame," and you stop breathing. You read, "The minute I heard my first love story, I started looking for you." And you wonder if this man just took your heart, set it on fire, and sent it spinning. But the real transformation is internal. Rumi stops being the tidy theologian and becomes a lover, a poet, a whirling storm of yearning. He writes like someone who's seen God and kissed him on the mouth. And the thing is, he hasn't lost his religion. He's just cracked it open. In Rumi's world, the divine isn't distant. God is the beloved who vanishes into alleyways, the wine that makes you weep, the silence between heartbeats. And Shams? Shams becomes the vessel, the trigger, the spark that lit the poem. Of course, this didn't go over well with everyone. Rumi had students, followers, a reputation. Shams was considered a bit of a loose cannon. He once said that too much theology rots the soul. When Rumi chose to spend days in seclusion with Shams, ignoring his duties, skipping lectures, and basically acting like a love-struck teenager, it ruffled some serious turbans. And then Shams disappeared. One day, gone. Maybe murdered by jealous disciples. Maybe vanished on his own terms, like a true mystic. Rumi was shattered, devastated, and that's when the poetry erupted. Page after page, in Persian, in Arabic, in a blur of metaphors and sobs. Rumi wasn't just writing love poems, he was writing through grief, trying to alchemize loss into divine union. This is where the whirling begins, not as a dance, but as desperation. Rumi starts spinning as a form of prayer, letting his body become a planet circling an invisible sun. He spins until his robe flares out like a question, until his thoughts quiet, until Shams is everywhere. The Mevlevi order, the whirling dervishes, forms from this motion. A ritual, a tradition, a way of communing with the divine through dizzying repetition. The idea is that by losing balance, you find it. That by spinning, you shed the ego. That the centrifugal force flings everything false away. There's a hidden eroticism to it, don't deny it. The robe billowing, the sweat, the surrender. It's a physical metaphor for the same emotional surrender Rumi writes about in his verses. And what verses they are. One line, "I want to see you." know your voice, recognize you when you first come round the corner. It's not subtle. It's not meant to be. Rumi isn't hiding anymore. He's singing naked into the wind, daring you to call it sacrilege. And yes, sex stories still creep in, even in the puffaivu. Sacred, one account, lifted from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, mentions a traveling poet dervish who visited Rumi's city with a very particular offer. He claimed that in union with another, one could experience a shadow of the divine. His preferred method involved breathing in sync, prolonged eye contact, and something called sacred stillness. You can guess where that ended up. Rumi never wrote directly about this event, but a flurry of poems from the period mention the touch that awakens eternity and the warmth that undoes years of fasting. Again, metaphor? Maybe, but don't kid yourself. Mystics were asexual ghosts. They had bodies. They used them. They just layered their moans with meaning. Let's go fringe for a second. Ever heard of the Sema spiral? It's a theory that the dervish spin actually aligns with ancient Mesopotamian agricultural rites, where circular motion was used to invoke fertility and seasonal change. Some scholars suggest that Rumi's whirling tapped into older pagan rhythms that had been sleeping under the soil of Islamic mysticism all along. It's unproven, of course. But once you've seen the dance, once you've heard the flute, you don't really care. Something ancient stirs in you, and there's always a debate. Historians bicker about whether Rumi's intense fixation on shams overshadows his Islamic credentials. Was he too sensual, too personal, too close to heresy? But these critics always underestimate the trick Rumi pulled. He didn't discard religion, he rewired it. He made longing sacred. He made the act of wanting holy. He showed that sometimes to seek God, you have to fall head over heels for someone who breaks you wide open. And you're starting to feel it too. That itch behind your ribs. That ache that isn't hunger, isn't thirst, isn't lust, and yet has flavors of all three. That's the door Rumi kicked open. And now you can't close it. Not completely. Not ever again. You blink, and the garden has changed. Now the moonlight glances off marble columns, and the wind carries a different perfume smoke, maybe, and rose oil, and something sharper. You are in Shiraz now, the city of poets, wine, and the kind of longing that tastes like a ripe fig split open too soon. The stars are too bright, the air too soft, and somewhere, behind a veil of embroidered muslin, someone is laughing in a way that makes you want to fall in love or ruin your life or both. And this is where you meet Hafez. Not the sanitized version they quote at spiritual retreats, but the real one. The man who played chess with metaphors and smuggled rebellion into couplets. His verses don't whisper, they seduce, tease, and sometimes slap you sideways with beauty so overwhelming it hurts. Hafez doesn't ask for your attention, he takes it, pours wine down its throat, and dares you to make sense of what just happened. You stand at the edge of his divan, a book so famously mysterious that people still open it at random to find their fate, like a tarot deck dipped in Persian ink. You crack the spine and it breathes. The first line hits you, something about lips. Like rubies, a glance that breaks empires, a goblet that overflows even when you haven't touched it. And you think, okay, he's talking about love. Then the second line swerves, mentions the mosque, the preacher, a stolen kiss behind a curtain. Now you're not so sure. By the third couplet, the beloved has become God, or wine, or maybe a metaphor for poetry itself. And that's the genius of Hafez. You never know exactly what or who he's talking about. But you feel it, deep in your marrow. You follow his voice through the city, winding past marble tombs and tiled bathhouses, through the narrow alleys where women with kohl-rimmed eyes peek out from shadowed courtyards, where boys with perfumed hair carry wine in forbidden jugs. Hafez writes about all of it. He was a mystic and a mischief maker, a lover of God and women and language, and probably himself. He was banned and beloved, copied and cursed, recited by illiterate soldiers and cunning queens alike. One story goes that a wealthy merchant once paid him in gold just to write a single line about the curve of his mistress's back. The poem that resulted caused 3 divorces, a duel, and at least one poem of response written in lipstick on a mirror. Fringe tidbit for you: in a rare 15th century manuscript margin, a scribe notes that Hafez's poems are too sweet to copy without weeping. Twice I had to stop and beat my chest before continuing. That's how potent this man's pen was. And, like Rumi before him, Hafez blurred the line between sensual and spiritual until it vanished. He wrote about the tavern like it was a temple. He described wine in a way that made sober scholars nervous. And when he spoke of the beloved, the details shimmered between human and holy eyes like ambushes, breath like incense, hands that granted absolution or broke you entirely. I am the slave of the moon-faced one, he wrote, whose locks are tangled like the chains of Judgment Day. Is that romance? Worship? Blasphemy with a side of perfume? All of the above, probably. Sex. Story time. This one's less about the act than the aftermath. According to Peter Webb's Erotic Spirit Through History, one tale from Hafiz's life involves a night spent with a palace singer, a young man whose voice was said to melt glass. The morning after, Hafez wrote a verse so intimate, so layered with shame and sweetness, that the singer fled the city in panic. The line, "Your absence sobered me, but my heart still reeks of you." When the singer returned months later, Hafez reportedly laughed, kissed his hand and said, "I never meant for you to leave, I just needed a line that hurt." That's Hafez in a nutshell, capable of loving you, mocking you, and immortalizing you in the same breath. And don't think the authorities didn't notice. Religious scholars tried to censor him, interpret him, tame him. They insisted the wine was just divine love, the kisses were metaphors, the tavern a symbol for mystical awakening. Hafez smiled politely and kept writing poems that sounded like foreplay with a ghost. Some say he even inserted coded messages in his verses to mock censors, using rhymes that hinted at names, gestures, or acts too vivid for polite company. Historians still argue whether Hafez was devout or irreverent, whether he hid his theology in erotic imagery, or his eros in theological language. But maybe that's the point: he didn't believe in separation. In his world, the divine and the carnal weren't opposites. They were mirrors facing each other, reflecting into infinity. There's a moment late at night, after too much sherbet and not enough reason, when you recite one of his verses out loud and feel your voice shake. I am the candle that burned in your night, the wind that scattered your prayers. And suddenly you realize this isn't about history anymore. This is about you, your own longing, the ache you carry for something, someone you can't quite name. Hafez names it for you. Then he laughs, tips his goblet, and disappears into metaphor. By now you understand, Persian poetry is not safe. It seduces you, undresses you, then hands you a riddle. And the worst part? You like it. You want more. And Hafez, that velvet-tongued menace, has been playing this game for centuries. You wake up under a fig tree, a little dizzy, the scent of crushed jasmine lingering in your nose, and the echo of a poem still ringing in your ears. You can't remember if you dreamt it or if Hafez whispered it into your sleep himself. Something about lips, something about wine, something about a kiss that was also a prayer. And now you have questions. Why do they keep talking about wine? Why do these Persian poets, many of them devout, mystic, Sufi, scholarly, fill their verses with taverns and goblets, drinking and drunkenness? You've read enough by now to know it can't just be alcohol. Or can it? Here's the thing. Wine, in Persian poetry, is never just wine. It's temptation, liberation, scandal, enlightenment. It's a code word that unlocks everything else. And you're going to need to stay sharp, because decoding these verses is like trying to guess someone's thoughts while they're winking at you from behind a curtain. Let's start. Simple. Wine is forbidden in Islam. No ifs, no buts. It's haram. And yet, in the golden age of Persian poetry, it shows up constantly. Not accidentally, gleefully. It spills from verses like ink from a broken pen. The poets write about it like it's the very juice of the soul, the lubricant of divine experience. But don't take it at face value. This is theater. This is metaphor on a tightrope. When Rumi talks about wine, he's rarely referring to something you can pour into a cup. More often, he means ecstasy, the kind that comes from union with the divine, the kind that rips your ego apart and leaves you spinning. But Hafez is murkier. Sometimes it feels like he really is talking about wine, like actual Shiraz, deep red and aged in cool clay. Sometimes he's mocking the hypocrisy of the clerics, those who preach purity by day and drink behind closed doors at night. And sometimes he's flirting with mysticism, using wine as a symbol for the loss of control, the sweet wreckage of surrendering to the divine, or to love, or to both. Because with these poets, God and the beloved often share a face. That's the trap and the thrill. One of Hafez's most quoted lines translates roughly to, "Bring me wine, for this long sorrow needs soft drowning." Is that depression? Is that spiritual thirst? Or is it just a man missing someone whose perfume still haunts his robes? Historians still argue whether this was subversion or surrender, whether Hafez was mocking piety or elevating pleasure. One scholar claimed the wine in his poems was metaphorical 90% of the time. Another scholar fired back. It's the other 10% that got him in trouble. But it's not just wine. It's who is serving it. The beloved, the cupbearer, often appears with rose-petal lips and eyelashes sharp enough to slice through reason. And more often than not, this figure is genderless, or at least ambiguously gendered, which brings a whole new layer of tension. In one verse, the poet praises the cupbearer's fingers, describing them as white as prayer beads and twice as dangerous. In another, he mourns the curve of their neck that bends like a crescent moon at dawn. Are we talking about a lover, a servant, a divine messenger? You're not sure. And that's the point. The ambiguity forces you into a state of suspension. You hover between meanings, between desire and devotion. Let's slip in a story here, because you earned it. In a palace on the edge of Isfahan, a 14th century poet named Badr wrote a sequence of quatrains that celebrated the beauty of a young cupbearer named Yusuf. Badr was subtle. He never used Yusuf's name. But everyone at court knew. Yusuf poured wine like a poem, elegant, precise, devastating. And Badr, torn between love and fear, encoded their affair in metaphors so dense they required a key. That key, hidden in the first letter of each quatrain, which spelled Yusuf's name when read in sequence. The poem survived. The affair did not. Yusuf was dismissed quietly, and Badr vanished from court records soon after. But the verses remain, tucked inside a manuscript now shelved in a provincial library in Kazvin, still aching with everything they dared not say. Fringe detail time. Some Persian taverns, especially those along trade routes, doubled as covert libraries. The wine sellers were often minor poets or retired calligraphers, and in the back rooms, hidden behind faded curtains, were shelves of banned verses, erotic commentaries, even hand-illuminated copies of the Kama Sutra translated with Persian metaphors. One French traveler in the 17th century wrote of entering such a tavern and being offered a glass of wine, a poem for the heart, and a scandal for the road. Now let's talk subversion. When a poet writes about wine, especially in a place where alcohol is banned, they're doing something dangerous. They're playing with fire. They're mocking power. You see, the real function of wine in these poems isn't just pleasure, it's rebellion. It's a raised eyebrow, a quiet giggle. In the back of the mosque, the poet is saying, "I know the rules. I just choose not to obey them with my tongue tied. And if you can't tell whether I'm serious or joking good, that means the poem is working. And while wine was the most frequent symbol, it wasn't the only one. Kisses, curls, half-lidded eyes, the rustle of the silk sash, these became part of a coded language. A lexicon of longing. You learned to read desire through shadows and syntax, through how a line curved, where it broke. A comma might mean hesitation, a repetition, obsession. And when the poet said night, he might have meant a body. And when he said dawn, he might have meant the regret of having to leave it. Even modern scholars get tripped up. Some translations try to clean up the mess, make it all about God, strip out the lust, tidy the metaphors. But doing that is like taking a rose and replacing its scent with statistics. You lose everything that makes it dangerous. Persian poetry, especially in this golden era, was a dance with fire. You couldn't always tell where the line was. And that's what made it worth walking. By now, you're beginning to feel it. The slip, the slide, the soft unraveling. You don't just read these poems, you start living in their rhythms, their cadences. You find yourself craving something unnamed. You pour a glass of water and wonder if it tastes like metaphor. Walk down the street and wonder if that stranger's smile could break your theology. Welcome to the wine-soaked world of Persian verse. You'll never see thirst the same way again. You walk through a narrow doorway draped in beaded strings, the kind that clink softly as you pass, and suddenly you're inside a room that doesn't seem to end. It's quiet, but not empty. It's full of breath, of presence, of language too dense to speak aloud. This is the chamber of the ghazal, the most seductive, elusive, maddening poetic form in Persian literature. And tonight, it's inviting you in for a lesson you won't soon forget. At first glance, a ghazal seems simple. A string of couplets, each 2 lines long, sometimes with a rhyme at the end. But as you press your ear closer, you start to notice something strange. The couplets are related, but not in the way you expect. They're like mirrors angled toward each other, each reflecting something, each fragment carrying a whole universe of longing. And in the space between these mirrors, between these lines, something happens. You get pulled in. The ghazal is built for paradox. It demands precision and chaos. It insists on unity and fragmentation. The poet begins with an idea, a heartbreak, a prayer, a glance, and then lets it fracture across the stanzas. Every couplet must be complete on its own. Every couplet must also deepen the whole. It's like trying to write 20 separate love letters that still form a symphony when read aloud. And it's not just technical, it's emotional architecture. The ghazal doesn't move in a straight line. It spins. It circles. It lures you in with a metaphor and then leaves you stranded in silence. You never get the whole truth. You get echoes, aftershocks, glimpses. And in these couplets, love is always just slightly out of reach. That's by design. The ghazal was born from separation, from distance. The word itself comes from the sound a wounded gazelle makes when it's cornered. That gasp, that cry, that's what you're hearing when you read it, right? And this form became the perfect vehicle for mystics and lovers alike. Because whether you're chasing God or someone who broke your heart in the marketplace, what you really want is the wanting. You don't want resolution. You want ache. Let's add some heat to that with a story. In the late 13th century, a minor poet named Jamil fell into obsessive love with the daughter of a powerful merchant in Koshan. She wasn't just beautiful, she was brilliant, wrote poetry of her own under a pen name, and had a habit of leaving riddles tucked into the sleeves of borrowed robes. Jamil, hopelessly smitten, wrote a ghazal every day for a year, each couplet describing a different part of her without ever saying her name. One line praised the shadow cast by lashes sharp enough to draw blood. Another mourned a voice that undresses memory. He left these verses at the doorstep of her family's bathhouse each morning, and she responded not with letters, but with edits, tiny ink marks in the margins, a red line through one metaphor, a question mark near another, a star beside thee. Ones she liked. Their entire affair unfolded like this, in verses, footnotes, and poetic games. Then one day, it stopped. No more edits, just silence. Jamil vanished from the city soon after. The next year, a new collection of ghazals appeared, under a new name rumored to be hers. In the final couplet of one poem, the poet writes, "I taught him to ache, and he thanked me by vanishing. Let this be my love story, unread, but immortal." And that's what the ghazal can do. It turns heartbreak into scripture. It dignifies longing. It stretches the soul until it sings. And when used by Sufi poets, it becomes something even more dangerous. Because now the beloved is God, or the idea of God, or a person who looks suspiciously like someone. You shouldn't be fantasizing about it, prayer. And the ghazal lets you get away with it. It gives you plausible deniability. "Oh no," says the poet, "that wasn't lust. That was spiritual metaphor." Sure it was. Quirky fact for you. In some Sufi circles, ghazals were used as diagnostic tools. A novice would be asked to compose one. Then the master would read it, line by line, and interpret the metaphors like a therapist reading dreams. He'd say, "Your mention of the locked gate suggests your ego is still too attached to worldly forms. Go sweep the courtyard for 3 more weeks." Think of it as poetic therapy crossed with spiritual boot camp. But the ghazal also became a way to flirt with real-world danger. You could slide forbidden feelings into couplets, address someone without naming them, hide passion in allegory. One 15th century poet, rumored to have been enamored with a visiting Ottoman prince, wrote a sequence of ghazals where each couplet mentioned a bird: the nightingale, the parrot, the falcon. Read closely, the bird spelled out a message using an acrostic pattern, each species standing for a Persian letter. When decoded, it read, "Come back, I still burn." The manuscript was seized, the poet imprisoned. But the ghazal survived, copied in secret, sung in back rooms. Now, the mechanics. There's a repeating word or phrase at the end of each couplet, called the radif. Think of it as the poem's anchor. Something soft and familiar that keeps drawing you back even as the emotions deepen. Then there's the kafiyah, the rhyme that precedes the radif. Together, they create a rhythm that feels like waves. You get lulled. And in that lull, the poet slips the knife. You're leaning in, expecting beauty, and then bam, a line that undoes you. The night was gentle, the candle kind. But your silence was a knife wrapped in velvet. That's the ghazal at work. And the last couplet? That's the makda. The final twist. Often the poet signs their name here, but not as a signature, more like a confession, a final reveal. Hafez, he writes, "Your love is a prison, but the walls are made of song." You hear that, and it lingers. Because the poet has just turned pain into beauty, loss into melody, longing into architecture. You're leaning against the edge of a marble fountain, trying to steady your breath when you catch a sound you weren't supposed to hear. Soft footsteps, a stifled giggle, a silk slipper dropped in haste. And just like that, you're pulled into one of the most delicious, dangerous settings in Persian history, the royal court. Not the public halls filled with scrolls and scholars, but the private wing, behind carved doors and perfumed curtains, where politics and poetry blur with pillow talk. Tonight, you're going to meet someone you were never meant to know, a court scribe whose ink-stained fingers have been writing more than just royal decrees. Somewhere between documenting treaties and copying religious texts, he's fallen into an affair with the Sultan's favorite concubine. Her name? Lost to history. But her scent, her laughter, her footprints, those live on in the quatrains he etched into the margins of royal correspondence. You're going to hear their story not from a history book, but from the whispers they left behind. Let's set the scene. The court is a hive of ritual and performance. Golden chandeliers drip like frozen sunlight. Guards stand like statues. The Sultan sits on a cushion embroidered with verses from the Quran, pretending not to notice the way his concubines glance at each other across the courtyard. And in the shadow of all this pomp, the scribe moves like a ghost. He's educated, invisible, and utterly underestimated, which makes him dangerous, because no one suspects a scribe of seduction. He's supposed to be the paper, the ink, not the hand reaching beneath a silk veil at midnight. But he writes. God does he write, and not just any poems. He composes rubaiyat quatrains, 4-line poems as sharp as daggers, compressed heartbreak, coded lust, every stanza a secret. One survives in an anonymous 14th century collection from Yazd. She asked for a verse. I gave her my pulse. She kissed it in ink. Now it won't. Stop beating. You don't write that about a metaphor. You write that about someone who makes you forget your own name. Their affair unfolds through glances and fragments. A line smuggled inside a scroll. A metaphor for thighs hidden in a tax decree. The courtly world is all performance, and their relationship becomes a play within a play. They meet in the library under the pretense of correcting manuscripts. He accidentally brushes her hand as they unroll a scroll. She laughs too loud. A eunuch coughs, and they freeze. Danger is part of the thrill. Each kiss feels like defiance. Each poem could be the last dot, and here's where it gets spicy in the academic sense. This relationship becomes a source of poetic innovation. The scribe, under pressure, creates new metaphors to mask desire. He compares her scent to the ink of midnight. Her gaze becomes a dagger drawn in moonlight. Her absence is the silence between two forbidden letters. These aren't just pretty lines, they're survival tactics. Historians still argue whether this explosion of poetic metaphor in Persian court literature was driven more by theology or by the sheer need to hide affairs like this one. You want fringe? Let's go. A 15th century calligraphy manual recovered. In Samarkand contains a curious appendix, a list of suggested flourishes for embellishing verses. One flourish, dubbed the secret hook, was said to mimic the silhouette of a woman's foot in repose. It was supposedly used by scribes to mark poems inspired by forbidden lovers, hidden in plain sight, unnoticed by censors, but recognized instantly by those in the know. Think of it as the poetic version of a burner account. Now, not every court poet got away with their secrets. One scribe was famously flogged for composing a quatrain about the queen's smile. It read, "Her laugh unbuttons kingdoms." Subtle? Barely, but that's the risk. When you turn the queen into a metaphor, you're either winning favor or walking into exile. And our scribe knew it. That's why he wrote his most intimate verses in double layers, each line holding two meanings. The rose that blooms at dusk could mean her mouth, or her body, or the idea of forbidden beauty itself. You'll never know. He wanted it that way. Sex story time. Michel Foucault, in his notes on secrecy and pleasure in Persian literature, references a scandal involving a court librarian who discovered an erotic poem slipped into a Quranic commentary. The poem described the moment, beneath the scent of camphor and orange blossom, where vowels fell from our mouths and hands spoke their own language. When questioned, the author claimed it was a metaphor for divine surrender. The librarian, reportedly unimpressed, said, "Next time God visits, maybe put some pants on." This tension between public decorum and private chaos was everywhere in court culture, and poetry became the pressure valve. It let the steam out in elegant lines. It made longing survivable, even glorious. And the scribe knew that every verse he wrote wasn't just a love note, it was a rebellion. Against hierarchy, against silence, against being invisible. But nothing this beautiful lasts forever. Eventually someone noticed. Maybe it was a jealous rival. Maybe it was just bad luck. A poem was found folded inside a hairbrush. One line, "You read me like a holy book, even when I'm closed," was too personal, too pointed. The concubine was transferred. The scribe disappeared. But his verses remained, passed around in secret, copied into margins, turned into lullabies and laments. And here's the punchline. Centuries later, scholars argued over who wrote them, whether they were part of Hafiz's early work, whether the she was metaphorical. They missed the point entirely. These weren't poems about abstraction. They were fingerprints, bruises in verse, proof that someone lived, loved, and risked everything for the chance to describe the taste of a stolen kiss in meter dot. So now you're standing in the echo of that room, where a scribe once kissed a concubine between syllables. And you understand something you didn't before. That poetry isn't just what survives history. It's what hides inside it. You slip out of the court through a narrow passageway flanked by frescoes half faded with time. But before the echo of that forbidden kiss fades from your ears, you step into a different kind of tension, quieter, sharper, electric in its subtlety. You're in a garden now, but not the romantic kind with songbirds and scented lanterns. This one's a little too perfect. The pathway's too symmetrical, the flowers too precisely trimmed. And standing in the center, leaning against a cedar tree, with a manuscript clutched to his chest, is a boy. Maybe 16, maybe younger. His cheeks are flushed, his curls perfect, and his presence makes the air tighten. Not because of who he is, but because of what he represents. You've just stepped into the most delicate, uncomfortable, and fiercely debated realm of Persian poetry, the world of homoerotic verse. Now breathe deep. This isn't scandal bait. This is history. This is longing carefully wrapped in language, pressed like a rose inside a book, passed hand to hand under the eyes of a society that spoke about beauty in codes dot in classical Persian verse. Beauty was everywhere, but it wasn't gendered the way we expect. The beloved capital B always is often described with a set of stock features: a mole like a drop of ink, hair that coils like a snake, a waist like a reed, and eyes that can maim armies. But here's the twist. Many of these descriptions match the aesthetic of young boys in the medieval Islamic world. And the poets knew that. They leaned into it. In fact, in many verses, the gender of the beloved is never clarified at all. You're left in the dark, aroused and unsure, caught between spiritual ecstasy and something that feels suspiciously physical. Take Sadi of Shiraz, one of the most influential poets of the 13th century. In his Bustan and Gulistan, he wrote openly, sometimes shockingly, so about the beauty of young men. One famous story tells of a journey through Damascus, where Sadi finds himself enamored with a boy drawing water from a well. His description? His lashes were so long, I thought them ropes cast down from heaven. His gaze so sharp, I forgot the taste of prayer. Is it just metaphor? Historians still argue whether these lines reflect actual desire or were merely part of a stylized literary convention. But you can feel it, can't you? That tug, that quiet charge. That way the poem lingers in your chest longer than it should. Wasn't just aesthetic admiration. It was a language of coded eras. The culture had strict moral frameworks, but also complex understandings of beauty, desire, and power. Poets navigated this labyrinth with the precision of a tightrope walker. One false metaphor, one too obvious rhyme, and they could be dismissed as obscene or worse. But when done right, these verses shimmered. They created a space where admiration didn't require confession, where love could exist without the need for definition. There's a story tucked in a 15th century commentary from Herat about a poet named Qasim who fell in love with a calligraphy student. The student was bright, quiet, and according to Qasim had wrists as delicate as a line break. Qasim wrote him dozens of couplets, none of which mentioned love directly. Instead, he praised the boy's penmanship, the way he bowed slightly before beginning a verse, the scent of rose ink he used. Eventually, the student left town, and Qasim never saw him again. But in his later work, he refers to the scent of ink as a symbol for unreachable desire. If you didn't know the story, you'd think it was just a metaphor. But now you do. And now it aches. Let's throw in a fringe fact. In some royal households, particularly in the Timurid and Safavid periods, young male pages were chosen not just for their intelligence, but for their beauty. They served wine, recited poetry, and were often the unspoken muses of older court poets. There's a preserved painting from the late 16th century showing a scribe handing a scroll to a boy who wears a robe too, sheer for comfort and smiles in a way that breaks every line of protocol. On the edge of that scroll, a couplet, faint but legible. You are the silence after music, the thing I did not know I was waiting for. That's not theology. That's thirst in calligraphy. And yet these expressions didn't exist in a vacuum. There were boundaries, real and dangerous ones. Accusations of indecency could destroy reputations. That's why poets developed a poetic sleight of hand. They could say, your cheek, and mean the moon. They could say, your voice, and mean the divine. But the reader, especially the knowing one, always felt the double meaning. One line stroked the ego. The other grazed the thigh of memory. Here's your sex story one that Foucault once noted in his Marginalia but never published. In a manuscript from Isfahan, an anonymous poet writes of a moment shared with a traveling lute player. They never speak. Just sit. The lute player begins a melody so slow it makes time crawl. The poet describes watching the player's hands move, then writes, when he struck the final note, my breath collapsed. I had not been touched, but I had been undone. No kiss, no embrace, just a performance, a look, a poem born from it. That's the kind of intimacy Persian poets captured, a heat that didn't always need flame. And scholars? Oh, they've wrestled with this. Some insist it's all innocent, just conventional language inherited from Greek aesthetics. Others argue that it's repression disguised as art. But the real answer might be simpler. It's longing. Pure, often misdirected, often dangerous, always poetic. These poets weren't writing manifestos, they were writing ache. And they were smart enough to lace that ache into verses that could be read a dozen different ways, depending on who's listening. So, now you're walking through this garden again, but it feels different. Every rose is suspect. Every breeze seems to carry a sigh. You're not just reading poems about love. You're standing inside them. And suddenly, you understand why Persian poets never needed to declare their beloved's gender. Because and it wasn't about that. It was about the yearning itself, the tension, the impossibility, the sweet, unresolvable agony of wanting someone who might be forbidden by law, by God, or simply by silence. You're standing in front of a door, made of carved cedar, half open, the kind that creaks just enough to warn you. What's behind here isn't safe, but it's beautiful. You step inside, and suddenly you're not in a room, you're inside a symbol. The rose, the mirror, the curl, the garden. The Persian poets didn't just write about love and longing. They built a whole private universe of symbols to speak. If fluently, a language of desire hidden in objects, so that even when they couldn't say what they wanted directly, they could still make you feel it. And tonight, you're going to learn how to read those symbols, not like a scholar, but like a lover. You start with the rose. Obvious, right? Red, soft, dangerous if you press too hard. But in Persian poetry, the rose isn't just a flower, it's the face of the beloved, the scent of temptation, the moment before the fall. And if the rose is the beloved, then the nightingale, the poor bird that sings endlessly into the night, is the poet, pining, circling, and bleeding through his beak just to be near her. Or him, or God, doesn't matter. What matters is the ache. That's where the poem begins. Now, the mirror. This one's more slippery. A mirror in Persian verse doesn't just reflect, it distorts, tempts, mocks. It's the way you see beloved's face, and the way you lose your own in the process. One couplet goes, "I looked into your eyes and saw myself. Then I shattered." That's not about vanity. That's about dissolving. About how love, when it's real, erases the border between self and other. The mirror can also mean truth, but not a comforting truth. A truth that strips you, makes you flinch. It's the moment when the metaphor stops working and you realize, oh, no, I actually love them. That's what the mirror shows you. Then there's the curl. The beloved's hair always described as black, coiled, perfumed, infinite. A single strand becomes a maze. A noose. A rope from heaven that drags the poet either toward ecstasy or annihilation. Hafiz once wrote, "If I could untangle your curl, I'd untangle the cosmos." Sounds romantic, but it's a trap. Because that curl never untangles. That's the point. The more the poet tries to reach the beloved, the deeper he gets lost. Historians still argue whether the curl was a mystical symbol or a sensual one. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe it was just the most beautiful part of someone they couldn't stop dreaming about. And don't even get started on the garden. On paper, it's paradise. In practice, it's a closed space with high walls where everything's blooming and nothing is simple. The garden is where the beloved walks barefoot at dawn, where the wine is passed, where the metaphors flirt with blasphemy. But the garden is also a trap, a metaphor with locked gates. You get in, but can't get out unchanged. These symbols weren't just poetic devices, they were survival tools. Imagine being a poet in a society where direct expressions of passion, especially same-sex or extramarital or mystically subversive passion, could get you imprisoned or worse. You'd need a way to say everything while appearing to say nothing. Enter symbolic language. It's not censorship. It's camouflage. And the best poets used it like a dagger hidden in silk. Let's drop into a real example. In a 14th century manuscript from Tabriz, there's a poem that seems, on the surface, to be about spring, blooming roses, soft winds, a skylark song. But look closer. The rose appears 3 times. Each time it's accompanied by a mention of blood. The mirror shows up once cracked, and the beloved's breath is said to turn the garden to ash. Not exactly cheerful imagery. What we're reading isn't a nature poem, it's a breakup poem so vicious, so coded, that only the poet and the person it was meant for could fully understand it. Or maybe not even them. Maybe it was just the poet trying to bleed in metaphor, because plain words wouldn't do. Sex story for you. In the court of a certain Safavid, prince name redacted for reasons that are still debated, there was a favorite concubine, known only by the nickname, the Censor. Why? Because she always carried one, burning rare incense. But rumor had it that she was also the anonymous author of several poems that described love scenes using only symbols. One poem described a rose weeping beside a well. Another mentioned 2 cups knocking gently in the dark. It wasn't until decades later that a rival poet claimed to have deciphered them and published an answer poem, "Your scent haunts me. I burn like your incense, but I do not name you." Let that be enough. Were they lovers, enemies, ghostwriters? Nobody knows. But the symbols keep circling. Here's a fringe fact that'll wrinkle your brow. In some mystical circles, especially among certain Sufi orders, initiates were taught to meditate not on the name of God, but on a single object, a rose, a curl of hair, even a glass of wine, until the object dissolved into pure feeling. The goal wasn't to understand the object. It was to become lost in it, to use beauty as a doorway to the divine. One master told his disciple, "Don't look for God in the heavens. Look in the space between petals." And that brings us to the real magic of Persian symbolism. It doesn't explain. It seduces, it invites. It demands that you slow down, lean in, look again. These aren't symbols you decode once. They evolve. Depending on your own ache, your own experience. That's why the same poem can feel romantic at 20, spiritual at 30, and devastating at 50. Because the rose hasn't changed. You have. Some critics, of course, try to pin it all down. They want to classify each object. The mirror means X, the garden means Y. But the poets themselves would have laughed. They knew that real power comes from ambiguity, from slippage, from the space between meanings. That's why the most dangerous verses are the ones that don't land neatly. They leave you dizzy, unsure, wanting. They make you ask questions you didn't know you had. And now you're in that space, standing in a garden made of metaphor, watching shadows move across stone, wondering if that nightingale's song is for a rose or for you. Wondering if you've ever wanted something, or someone with the intensity that could crack a mirror. That could make a single curl into a whole theology. That could turn a poem into a prayer you never meant to say out loud. Welcome to the language of symbols. You're fluent now. But don't expect it to save you. It was never meant to. You wake before dawn, wrapped in silence so thick it feels like velvet. A candle guttering low, the scent of ink still fresh. The poem you dreamed has vanished, but the feeling lingers like a secret barely held in your throat. And now, as the light softens into pale silver, you open your eyes to the most dangerous idea in all of Persian poetry. Poetry itself. Not the kind you recite in classrooms or engrave on tombstones, but poetry as weapon, as veil, as mirror-smashing confession. Tonight, you learn how Persian poets didn't just write verses. They carved escape routes from dogma and survival. Maps through repression. Because if words can break hearts, they can also slip through jail bars. In a culture where theology ruled public life, and censors sat like vipers behind scrolls, poetry became the ultimate loophole. You couldn't say you wanted someone, but you could describe the curve of a flower, the temperature of a breath, the taste of absence. You couldn't criticize a ruler directly, but you could write about a tyrant-faced moon whose shadow blackened. Roses, and the right people would understand. Poetry became a shell game. The surface innocent, the subtext explosive. That's how poets lived between the lines. You'll see it most clearly in the ghazals of Obaid Zakania, 14th century satirist, who deserves his own HBO series. On the surface, his poems were playful, even bawdy. But woven into the sexual innuendo and street slang were vicious critiques of religious hypocrisy, class hierarchy, and political corruption. One poem describes a man so obsessed with purity, he refuses to touch water and ends up drowning in sand. Another ends with the line, "I trusted a saint and found my purse gone." That's not just sass, it's social commentary, disguised as bedroom gossip. And then there's Kemal Kujandi, a contemporary of Hafez, who wrote in a style so double-edged it could make you laugh and cry in the same breath. In one verse, he praises the beloved's lips as sweeter than sermons, more honest than preachers. That's not just about love. That's a blade slipped under a smile. Historians still argue whether Kuyandi's poems were subtle acts of resistance or just spiritual flirtation. The truth is probably both, because in this world, a metaphor could mean salvation or damnation, depending on who was reading. Take this. In the early 15th century, a court poet named Mir Ali Shir was summoned before a governor for writing seditious verse. The offending lines? "In gardens of gold, silence blooms like weeds. But in back alleys, the roses still speak." Too vague to be a confession, too pointed not to be. Mir Ali claimed the poem was about the soul's journey through pride and humility. The governor, not a man known for his subtlety, disagreed. The poet was imprisoned for a year. When released, he wrote nothing but love poems about bread and rain for a while. Then one day, slipped inside a folio of devotional texts appeared. A new poem. One line read, "The cage cannot silence the nightingale. It just teaches him new keys." That's the power of poetry here. It's not just language, it's camouflage. And when wielded well, it's dangerous. Let's talk about patronage. Persian poets didn't write in ivory towers. They wrote in courts, in the shadows of sultans and viziers. That meant every line was political. Praise too empty, and you were dismissed. Praise too poetic, and you were suspected. Satire was fatal if misunderstood. Sincerity was risky if unguarded. So poets learned to dance between meaning and mystery. They praised a ruler's justice while hinting at his cruelty. They described paradise while slipping in images of exile. Quirky detail for you. Some poets developed entire systems of symbolic substitution, lists of code words and parallel meanings, so that their poems could carry double or triple interpretations. One 14th century poet, Jalil of Ray, reportedly used fig to mean wealth, olive to mean power, and pomegranate to mean lust. Scholars didn't decode the system until centuries later, after finding a private notebook tucked behind a wall panel in his family estate. The notebook contained 173 authorized metaphors. One entry reads, "To write of figs when figs are forbidden is to test the teeth of censors." Even religious themes weren't safe from poetic transformation. The Quran forbade explicit depiction of divine attributes, but poetry could imply, could allude, could wrap divinity in silk. One Sufi poet compared God's mercy to a cool hand on a fevered brow, and his wrath to wine turned to ash on the tongue. It's not doctrine, it's impressionism. And it opened a door for mystics, lovers, heretics, and dreamers to speak the unspeakable. Here's your sex story, tangled in this web of subversion. In a manuscript dated to the Timurid era, a poem describes a rendezvous between a scholar and a bookbinder's apprentice. The poem is laced with jokes about spines and binding, but toward the end, it slips into something softer. "Your fingers left ink on my collar. I did not clean it. I wanted it to be seen." The poem was unsigned, but the calligraphy matches known works by a cleric who later disappeared from public record. His official biography lists him as retired to private study. His poems, meanwhile, continued to circulate under pseudonyms, whispered between bathhouses and backrooms. And this wasn't fringe. It was central. Poetry wasn't ornamental, it was the bloodstream of Persian cultural and intellectual life. It shaped reputations, determined alliances, shifted public opinion. One well-placed verse could elevate a minister or doom a noble. And poets knew this. They weren't naive. They were strategic. They used metaphor the way a fencer uses a blade. Not to defend, to provoke, to control the tempo, to draw blood, then vanish. Which brings us to the most fascinating paradox. Persian poetry was celebrated and censored, revered and reviled, quoted in mosques and burned in piles. It walked a tightrope between ecstasy and exile, and every great poet knew how to balance. They became masters of ambiguity, not because they were cowards, but because they were survivors. Because they understood that in a world ruled by rigid truth, ambiguity was the last refuge of freedom. Now, you sit in the quiet again, the candle burned low. One line from earlier won't leave you alone. The tongue lies. The poem tells. And you wonder how many truths have been disguised as metaphors. How many loves have been buried in couplets? How many rebellions have started with a rhyme? You're not sure. But you know this. You'll never read poetry the same way again. You'll start looking for the secret meanings, the soft glances, the forbidden metaphors, the way desire wears a disguise. And you'll remember that in the world of Persian verse, the poem isn't the mask. It's the mirror. The stars begin to pull back into the ink-black sky, but something below them glows brighter, a manuscript half unrolled, parchment edged in gold, its verses swimming in curves and constellations. You're in a study now, a scholar's chamber, but it might as well be a planetarium. Because tonight, you don't just read the poem, you chart it. Persian poetry didn't just borrow from the heavens, it flirted with them, wooed them, made metaphors out of moonlight and prophecies out of eyelashes. And as you step into this shimmering cosmos, you're about to learn how poets linked lust in the stars, how astrology became a map for desire, and how bodies celestial and human became interchangeable in the ink-slicked lines of longing. Look up. The night sky is not silent, it's gossiping. And it has a lot to say. Let's begin with Venus, always Venus. In Persian poetry, Venus isn't just a planet. She's the queen of seduction, patron of music, mistress of all things beautifully dangerous. If the moon is the face of the beloved, then Venus is their soul, glistening, magnetic, slightly cruel. One poet wrote, "Her voice struck my chest. Like Venus at her zenith, too radiant to survive." And Mars? Mars was the rival, the interloper, the presence that disrupts harmony. So when a poet claims Mars stood between me and my beloved's kiss, it isn't astronomy, it's heartache. Mapped in planetary conflict, the beloved's eyes become stars. Their curls, comets, their breath, lunar eclipses. Even their cruelty gets cosmic treatment. One 13th century poet described his heartbreak as a Saturn transit through the house of love. If that sounds like astrological drama, it is. But it's also a coping mechanism. Because when desire feels overwhelming, it helps to pretend it's the stars' fault. The poets weren't naive. They knew astrology was imperfect. But it was seductive. It gave shape to the shapeless. It let them say, "It wasn't me who fell. It was the planets who pushed." Fringe tidbit for you. In medieval Persia, especially during the Timurid and Safavid eras, it was common for poets to consult astrologers before launching major works. The logic? A poem written under Venus would be sensual, under Mercury witty, under Jupiter wise. Some even inscribed the planetary hour of composition in the margins, like a celestial birth certificate for the poem. One surviving manuscript from 1421 includes this note: "Written in the hour of Mercury, kissed by Venus, ignored by Mars." Sounds like a love triangle. Probably was. And the stars weren't just metaphors. They were models. Think of the poet as an ancient astronomer, charting not just heavenly motion, but human emotion. The micro reflecting the macro. The chaos in your chest explained by the movement of spheres. This was more than poetry, it was cosmology. One Sufi scholar even described love as the gravity of the soul, pulling toward the divine orbit. That's not just mysticism. That's physics disguised as prayer. Of course, not everyone was on board. Some theologians dismissed astrology as superstition. Others worried that comparing divine love to celestial mechanics cheapened God. But poets? They didn't care. They saw the stars and reached for metaphor. Hafez, as always, was ahead of the game. He wrote, "They say Saturn rules my fate, but your smile outshines all his eclipses." That's not just romantic. That's a middle finger to determinism. Sex story time. This one from Peter Webb's Erotic Spirit Through History. A court astrologer in Shiraz, known for his brilliant charts and impeccable scandal management, was rumored to have seduced half the nobility by offering personalized planetary readings. One of his clients, a minor prince, received a chart that read, "Venus favors your left side tonight." Later that week, a poem appeared anonymous, of course describing a kiss that turned Mercury retrograde. Historians debate whether the poem came from the prince or the astrologer. Either way, the stars were not consulted for permission. Back to the symbols. The moon, always present, was rarely just the moon. It was a face, a breast, a lover's indifference. In one couplet, a poet laments, "Your face was full tonight, but cold. A moon I could not warm, and the stars themselves? Countless, unreachable, watching." You'll find verses where they blink like witnesses to a secret tryst. Others where they mock the poet's desperation, remaining silent while he begs for Guidance, it's drama, yes, but it's also theology. Because in Persian thought, especially Sufi-inflected cosmology, the stars are more than decoration, they're signs. They don't control fate, they reveal it. And what about eclipses? Now that's where it gets juicy. An eclipse in a poem usually signals betrayal, confusion, the temporary loss of clarity. One poet describes making love during an eclipse as like kissing through a veil made of shadow. Not explicit, but you feel the tension, the obscuring, the thrill, the terror. Historians still argue whether poets actually believed in these cosmic metaphors or used them purely as devices. But the emotional resonance, undeniable. The universe became a theater for inner turmoil. And the beloved, in this cosmic drama, often becomes a constellation always visible, never reachable. In one heartbreaking quatrain, a poet says, "You rise nightly above my bed, but never fall into it." That's astronomy weaponized for heartache. And in the poet's world, this separation is sacred. You're meant to long, to ache. Because longing keeps the stars in motion. It fuels the poetry. Even time itself bends under this poetic astrology. A moment with the beloved might be described as a Venus hour stretched into eternity. An absence might feel like a Mercury retrograde without end. These aren't cliches. They're attempts to give structure to the shapelessness of emotion. To make time behave like a poem, elastic, moody, punctuated by metaphor. Now, let's tilt the lens. What did the stars mean for gender, for power? Some poets used planetary metaphors to challenge hierarchy. They wrote of lovers born under unlucky stars who still managed to set fire to kings' hearts. One even described his muse as the rogue comet who scorched my orbit. That's not just romantic, it's rebellious. Because it says, destiny be damned. Love rewrites the sky. And now you're standing under it. The sky, the same one Hafez cursed, the same one Rumi danced beneath, the same one where every longing poet in every dusty courtyard looked up and said, please, just one sign. And maybe you feel that now too. That pull, that old ache, given new shape. Maybe you're thinking about someone who left, or someone who never arrived, and the stars don't answer. They never do, but the poems? They do something better. They echo. So next time you read a line about a crescent moon, or a jealous Mars, or a smile bright enough to eclipse Saturn, don't just see the metaphor. See the poet, lying on a rooftop, heart cracked open, begging the night to explain why. They still feel this way. And understand that longing isn't just ancient. It's yours. You walk now along a colonnade lined with shadows, the sound of your footsteps dulled by old carpets and older grief. At the far end, a doorway yawns open, not into a room, but into a story. A long one, twisting, layered, epic. This is no fleeting quatrain or flirtatious couplet. Tonight, you step into the realm of the Masnavi, the marathon form of Persian poetry, where stories unfold like silk rolls, each verse tied to the next like beads in a rosary of desire, loss, and spiritual ambition. If the ghazal was a sigh, the Masnavi is an exhale that lasts for days. And in this form, love doesn't just ache, it becomes pilgrimage. And you are already on the road. The Masnavi, by design, is expansive. Unlike the tight-lipped precision of the ghazal, it allows the poet to wander, to digress, to nestle parables inside passion and wrap metaphysics in metaphor. Rumi's Masnavi, the Manavi, is the most famous of the Form 6 volumes. Tens of thousands of lines, a mystical encyclopedia disguised as a love letter to the ineffable. But he wasn't the only one. Poets used this structure to trace the arc of longing from first glance to final oblivion. And the beloved in these stories is more than a person. They are journey, mountain, mirage. Sometimes, they're even the destination that disappears once you reach it. Imagine this. A prince sees a shepherd's daughter bathing in a stream. he's struck dumb. He forgets his name, his title, his god. He follows her. He writes 100 verses just to describe how she dried her hair. But when he finally speaks to her, she laughs and vanishes. What follows is a masnavi, not just of pursuit, but of transformation. The prince goes mad, joins a Sufi order, travels barefoot across deserts, learns to love the absence itself. In the final lines, he finds her again, only to discover she was never real. Or worse, that she was, but the person he became could no longer desire her. That's the Masnavi experience. It lures you in with lust and leaves you stripped bare in front of your own soul. This form allowed poets to tell the kinds of stories that couldn't fit into neat little rhymes. Stories of exile and return, of passion that turns spiritual, of spiritual quests that get derailed by a single glance. And often, the turning point, the real emotional fracture, comes not from union, but from its denial. One lover refuses. One door closes, one kiss is missed. And the poem shifts from erotic to ecstatic. Not because the desire fades, but because it changes shape. There's a famous Masnavi by Nizami Ganjavi, Layla and Majnun, the Persian Romeo and Juliet, but deeper, weirder, and far more emotionally volatile. Majnun falls for Layla so hard that he becomes a public hazard, writes poems in mud, talks to trees, eats sand. Her father refuses the match, citing Majnun's lack of decorum and possibly mental stability. Layla is married off to another man. Majnun doesn't protest, he just walks into the wilderness and becomes a poet mystic, writing verse so raw that wolves lie down to listen. Years later, Layla dies. Majnun visits her grave, lies down, and dies of heartbreak. Or enlightenment. Historians still argue which. But the Masnavi doesn't tell this as a cautionary tale. It presents Majnun's madness as a kind of sacred clarity. The idea that to love someone so completely, even without touch, even in rejection, is to approach the divine. It's romantic masochism, or holy masochism. And it hits deep. Sex story, naturally. One lesser-known Masnavi from the 14th century, attributed anonymously, tells the tale of a merchant who falls in love with a perfume seller. He visits the stall daily, buying scents he doesn't need, until finally the seller offers him a vial called Night's Embrace. The merchant opens it at home and faints. He dreams of making love to the seller in a garden made entirely of scent roses that moan, vines that tighten, air that whispers verses. He wakes, writes an epic poem, and never returns to the stall. Why? Because the dream was more complete than the reality could ever be. In one haunting couplet, he writes, "I knew your touch would end the dream, so I touched your echo instead." This wasn't erotic in the way you expect. It was poetic. Yearning turned sensory hallucination. And that's the Masnavi trick. It stretches longing until it transforms. Fringe fact for flavor. Some Masnavis were recited aloud over several nights in Sufi lodges, each session ending on a cliffhanger, much like your favorite Bingable series. These weren't just poems. They were communal rituals. Listeners would weep, sigh, sometimes shout, overcome by the beauty and intensity of the unfolding tale. One recorded account from 1502 mentions a dervish fainting during the third night of a Masnavi reading, clutching his chest and whispering, "She has not arrived." Whether she referred to the beloved in the story or someone else entirely was never clarified. But the ache? Oh, the ache was real. There's a knock at the edge of your thoughts. Soft, almost apologetic. You open the mental door, and standing there is a man wrapped in threadbare robes, barefoot, eyes sunken but burning, clutching a book and smiling like he knows a secret. He's a poet, clearly, but not the kind you're used to. No velvet turban, no jeweled ring. This one looks like he hasn't eaten in days, and still thinks hunger is a gift. Welcome to the paradox of the poet ascetic, the mystic who wrote poems. about renunciation but couldn't stop describing lips, hips, wine, and the sound a beloved makes while laughing through tears. This is where Persian poetry ties itself in the most delicious knot. Because how, you ask, can someone claim to abandon the world, to deny the flesh, to dissolve the self and still write verse so soaked in longing it could steam off the page? The answer is complicated, but don't worry. You'll feel it before you understand it. You're sitting across from this poet now, watching him trace letters into dust. He says he's done with desire. Says he's left it behind, along with sleep, money, and his family name. But then he recites a couplet so vivid, you can practically see the beloved's ankle flash behind a curtain. And you wonder, is he lying? Or is this just how devotion works now? Because in Sufism especially, longing wasn't a bug. It was the system. The ache you felt for someone, anyone, that was the training ground for divine yearning. You want? Good. Now want better. Want bigger. Want until it breaks you. Take Kusha Abdullah Ansari of Herat, devout Sufi, nicknamed the Sage of Herat, who wrote devotional prose so pure it could make a rock repent. But his poems? They melt. In one line he writes, I left the world to find God, but in the scent of your sleeve I forgot my prayers. Not subtle, and not meant to be. That's the trapdoor. The mystic claims to renounce, but the language betrays him. Again and again, we find ascetics who've supposedly transcended desire, sneaking metaphors into their poems so steeped in sensuality that theologians had to invent new categories just to deal with them. Historians still argue whether this tension was deliberate or subconscious. Were these mystics truly struggling with earthly longing, or were they using it as bait to pull us toward something higher? One school says they were sublimating real desires into spiritual symbols. Another says they were just really, really good at compartmentalizing. Either way, the result is poetry that bleeds at the seams, language stretched between fasting and feasting, silence and song, robe and robelessness. Let's pull out a sex story to warm the tea. In the writings of Foucault, there's a reference to a Sufi master from Balkh who maintained a strict vow of celibacy, publicly, privately. However, he had a peculiar habit. Every Thursday, he'd meet a young lute player under a fig tree at the edge of town, not for touch, not even for talk, just to listen. The boy would play, the master would close his eyes, and after an hour, he'd whisper a single verse. One week it was this: I kissed you with my silence. Don't make me speak. Years later, those verses were compiled into a book titled The Quiet Garden. Whether the relationship was ever physical is irrelevant. The emotional current? As raw as a torn prayer rug. And what of the dervishes? The whirling ones? The street mystics? They spun through towns barefoot, slept in courtyards, stole metaphors from stars. Many claim to have renounced worldly love, but their poems tell another story. There's a record of a dervish in Yazd who is famous for two things: living without possessions and reciting couplets so charged with longing that married women reportedly fainted. He was once accused of causing emotional damage by recitation. His defense? If the poem reaches the heart, blame the heart. Fringe detail. Some Sufi orders developed coded clothing styles to mark internal spiritual stages. A torn sleeve might signal heartbreak, an uneven hem humility. But one particular group, the Malamesha, took it further. They believed any visible piety was vanity, so they wore their sins like badges, drank in public, flirted, and still wrote verses that described God with such intimacy it made Orthodox clerics clutch their chests. A Malamati poet once wrote, "He who fears hell worships himself. I fear losing your voice in my silence." That's not a threat. That's devotion disguised as defiance. But the most haunting tension, the one that hums beneath all these verses, is the fact that renunciation itself can become a kind of desire. You give something up, and the absence begins to glow. You say you've let go, and suddenly it clings harder. A poet writes, "I abandoned the rose to praise the thorns, but the scent won't leave my skin." That's not failure. That's the system working. The longing is the path. The ache is the proof. And you start to realize maybe these poets weren't contradicting themselves. Maybe they were documenting the real process of spiritual evolution. You start by wanting. You try to stop. You fail. You write about the failure. The writing becomes prayer. The prayer becomes obsession. And before you know it, you're no longer sure if you're talking to your beloved or to God. Maybe they've merged. Maybe they were never separate. One Sufi manual from the 12th century includes a curious exercise. Before you sleep, write a poem to the one you love most. Do not name them. In the morning, read it aloud. If it still makes you tremble, it was for God. That's not theology. That's therapy. That's desire turned into devotion by pure proximity. So here you are, sitting in the ashes of your own contradictions. You want, and you don't. You renounce, and you remember. You pray, but your prayer smells like the hair of someone you miss, and you think, maybe that's not failure. Maybe that's how it's supposed to be. Because Persian poetry never promised answers. It promised beauty. And if that beauty hurts, even better. So next time you hear someone claim to have renounced the world, ask them what their poems say. Ask them who they write about at midnight. Ask them what scent they still can't forget. And if they hesitate, smile. You've just met another lover disguised as an ascetic. There's a breeze tonight, not from the outside world, but from memory itself, dusty, perfumed, slightly scandalous. You follow it through a half-lit corridor lined with forgotten manuscripts, pages curled like sleeping cats, spines cracked, verses bleeding from the margins. And somewhere in this room, under a layer of time and threat, you find it. A forbidden book. Not forbidden by violence or overt rebellion, but by suggestion, by the way it smells of skin and syllables. You're in the realm of banned poetry. Now pillow talk scribbled on parchment, verses passed in secret from hand to hand like kisses behind curtains. The kind of poems that never make it to official anthologies. Not because they weren't brilliant, but because they were too honest. Too bodily. Too dangerous in their intimacy. This isn't about pornography. Persian literature didn't do smut. It did elegance with teeth, sensuality disguised as devotion. And in these banned works, the mask slips, just slightly. Enough for you to see a shoulder, a gasp, a trace of mascara on a lover's palm. These books weren't published, they were copied, by candlelight, by trembling hands, tucked between theology and history, like wildflowers pressed into the pages of legal codes. One such book, recovered in the late 19th century from the library of a crumbling palace outside Kazvin, contained nothing but anonymous rubaiyat. But the footnotes were written by a woman. Her handwriting curved like music. One note, next to a poem about a lover's sigh, simply reads, "He used to sound like that." That's what you're dealing with here. Not pornography. Memory, confession, a record of the body through metaphor. In one poem, the beloved's navel is a small mouth that never lies. In another, a kiss is described as a silent sermon between two breathless prophets. You don't need diagrams. You need imagination. And these poets had more than enough. Let's talk about the bathhouse. The hammam, Persia's most steamy literary setting, literally and figuratively. It was where class distinctions dissolved with clothing, where bodies mingled under steam, and where poems were murmured in the lathered space between gossip and prayer. One manuscript, barely surviving, tells of a young scribe who memorized verses to whisper into the ear of a merchant's wife while rinsing her hair. He never wrote them down. He said the water would carry them better. The last line she remembered, "If I am soap, let your hands forget sin." Fringe fact, during the Safavid period, Certain poetry collections were bound with false titles like On the Principles of Hygiene or Ethics of Market Life to avoid confiscation. Inside, however, the pages bloomed with couplets about stolen glances, hidden caresses, and dreams too vivid to be purely divine. Some of these volumes were passed between lovers like sacred relics. You'd find a verse circled in red, a margin annotated with a single date. No names. Names were too risky. But the words were alive. And what about the women? Oh yes, they were here too. Not many, but enough to leave traces. Their voices often erased from official records, but whispered between lines. In one private collection, attributed to the Sultana of Silence, there's a poem that begins, "His prayer rug was velvet. I was the floor." That's not passive. That's power inverted, claimed, wrapped in poetry. And she wasn't alone. Pillow books existed, collections of poems shared between lovers in private, usually handwritten, sometimes illustrated with small paintings that blurred the line between devotion and desire. They were passed like secrets, burned in emergencies, mourned like lost lovers when confiscated. Sex story time. Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings mentions a Persian consort who, after being caught in an affair with a musician, composed a verse from her prison cell. It read, "I tasted his music with my skin. The guards call it sin. I call it rehearsal." The poem was later quoted in court by her sister, veiled in metaphor, to shame a hypocritical vizier who'd once recited the same musician's praises. That's how poems survived, not just on paper, on lips, on gossip, on revenge. And when these poems didn't survive, when they were burned or buried, the echoes remained. You find them in the way certain poets pause mid-line, as if to catch a memory too dangerous to name. In the way metaphors grow teeth at the edge of a verse. The garden was silent, one poem says, but the breeze remembered. That's not nature. That's nostalgia masquerading as landscape. That's a lover's touch, archived in the scent of jasmine and regret. Historians still debate whether these banned works were truly erotic or merely symbolic, whether they were acts of rebellion or just romantic exuberance. But ask anyone who's ever read one in secret, by candlelight, with a heartbeat in their throat, and they'll tell you. These weren't just poems. They were maps, escape routes, time machines to moments too tender or too brutal for public light. Even today, traces survive. In private homes, in oral tradition, in libraries where certain shelves are never officially listed. One Iranian librarian in the 1970s described the whisper shelf, a corner of the archives where staff shared poems that had no catalog number, no author, just breath. One such fragment reads, "She left her veil on my shoulder. I keep it folded between pages that don't belong to me." That's all. Just that. And yet it says everything. So now you're holding one of these forbidden verses, reading it slowly, letting it bloom in your mind. Maybe it's about someone you lost. Maybe it's about someone you never touched but still dream of. Maybe it's about a version of yourself you're only now remembering. And the poem doesn't explain. It just holds you, whispers, "You're not alone." Because that's what these banned texts do. They don't shock, they soothe. They say, "I felt it too. I wasn't supposed to, but I did." And in a world where desire is policed and memory punished, that whisper is everything. A curtain rustles behind you, Silk, definitely, and the room shifts. The air tilts, thickens. The echoes of poets and patrons fade just enough to let a new voice rise. It's softer, sharper, maybe a bit reluctant, but there's iron under the breath. You've been wandering through centuries of Persian verse, surrounded by men weaving metaphors like smoke, dipping pens in longing, and spilling desire like wine across the page. But now finally, you hear someone who doesn't wait to be invited into the room. She steps in. She writes. And you listen. Welcome to the narrow, luminous corridor where the women poets lived, rare, quiet, but far from silent. If history remembered them less, it wasn't because they whispered. It's because the walls were too thick. But tonight, you press your ear close. The first voice is faint, a name carved into the corner of a manuscript. Mahasti. 12th century, a court poet, a woman. She wrote in the style of the great masters, but slipped in tricks they didn't dare. Her beloved was sometimes a man, sometimes a woman, sometimes a force of nature that wore both masks. In one quatrain, she writes, "He says my poems are soft, I say his hands are loud." That's not just flirtation, that's a sword fight in verse. She wasn't hiding. She was challenging, on paper, anyone who thought poetry was a masculine inheritance. It wasn't just Mahasti. There were others, scattered like hidden rubies across the centuries, names half erased by archivists, who weren't sure what to do with women who wrote about pleasure in God in the same breath. Rabia Balki, for example, who allegedly slit her wrists in a bath and wrote her final poem in blood on the wall. Too dramatic? Maybe. Or maybe she was just the first to carve poetry into death the way men had carved it into wine bottles. Her verses didn't beg. They bit. "If I write of love," she said, "don't ask the name. Ask how it feels when your chest won't open." And the themes? Not so different. Longing, spiritual confusion, bodily memory. But with a twist, these women weren't just yearning. They were watching, observing, turning the male gaze around and holding it like a dagger. One anonymous poem, likely composed in the 17th century and attributed in some circles to a courtesan, begins, "He praised my silence, not knowing I was writing him into ruin." That line isn't just about power, it is power. Let's talk. Bodies. The male poets waxed poetic about curls, moles, the sweet ache of waiting. But the women? They got practical. They wrote about breath, temperature, hunger that had nothing to do with metaphor. One poet described her lover's chest as a book I opened too soon, full of letters I couldn't yet read. Another said, "I watched him undress like dawn strips the stars." That's not just sensual, it's lived in. It's a woman reclaiming metaphor from the abstract and stuffing it with real, messy, gorgeous experience. Sex story time. This one winds through shadows. In a hidden archive in Yazd, there's a poem scribbled into the final page of a prayer book. It's unsigned, written in a woman's hand, and it reads, "We shared a fig. He took the seed. I took the sweetness." That's all, but what a story. What a balance of sensuality and economy. She didn't need 20 lines. She needed 5 words. And in them, desire, power, memory, and a little smirk you can almost see from 500 years away. Fringe detail. In certain aristocratic households, especially under the Qajar dynasty, women were trained not just in embroidery and etiquette, but in verse composition. Some produced entire divans of poetry kept private, circulated only among women, sometimes shared during tea ceremonies like secret currency. One noblewoman even had her verses copied onto plates, used only during all-female gatherings. One plate survives. Its inscription? "He was not worth the ink, but I wrote him anyway." Iconic. Of course, this visibility came with risk. A woman. Poet could be praised for elegance one day, punished for impropriety the next. One 18th century writer, only referred to as BBK, was said to have been exiled for composing a verse that included the phrase, "bare feet, bare heart." Too suggestive, apparently. But her poem survived, copied into a merchant's journal, and carried across 2 continents. You can still find it quoted, unattributed, in modern anthologies. Because good poetry doesn't ask permission. It lingers. Historians still argue whether Persian women poets were given space or simply seized it. Whether their writing was tolerated or overlooked. The truth? Likely both. But what matters now is that they existed. That their verses, though fewer, cut just as deep, kissed just as sharply, and whispered just as boldly into the dark. And here's the deeper magic. These women weren't just reacting to male traditions. They were innovating, experimenting, inverting the classic metaphors. One poet took the nightingale and turned it into a cage. Another described her desire not as fire, but as a garden overwatered, wild, unpruned. One even wrote a poem, in which the moon, normally a symbol for the beloved, was described as a lamp I turned off so I could see myself. Now you might be thinking, if they were so rare, why do they matter so much? Because in a tradition as rich and densely populated as Persian poetry, even a whisper can shift the architecture. These women shifted it. They bent the form. They challenged the content. They dared to imagine that longing didn't have to be passive, that metaphors could lead somewhere other than a man's shadow, that mysticism wasn't a masculine domain, and neither was eros. So tonight, as you sit with their verses still glowing behind your eyes, you realize you've been walking through a history mostly told in one voice, but not anymore. Now you've heard the countersong. It's softer, yes, but not weaker. It hums like a string pulled too tight. It resonates. It lasts. You step out of the manuscript vault and into somewhere warmer, too warm, actually. Muggy, golden, heavy with scent. The walls pulse with velvet, the air thick with oud and orange blossom. You've entered the courtesan's chamber. Not some scandalized brothel whispered about in footnotes, but a real, lived-in world where poetry wasn't just decoration, it was currency, weapon, diary, and confession. This is where metaphor takes off its veil, where perfume bottles become prophets and beds become altars. Tonight, you'll hear from a woman who didn't just quote poetry, she lived inside it. She knew which verses could seduce a vizier, flatter a scholar, undo a priest. She wrote not just for beauty, but for survival. And her name? Gone, lost in the smoke. But her voice? You're about to hear it. Imagine her now, reclining on a divan, ankle tucked beneath thigh, henna fading from the inside of her wrist, reciting a line from Hafez with a smile that says, "Yes, I've read the scholars too, but I also know how to make a man forget his lineage." She isn't an ornament. She's an operator. In a culture where women were often expected to stay silent, the courtesan found her loophole in poetry. She couldn't speak politics, so she seduced with subtext. Couldn't write theology, so she flirted with metaphor. She wasn't just memorizing verses, she was using them like a deck of cards. Shuffling, dealing, always a step ahead. And she had to be. Courtesans weren't just lovers. They were entertainers, companions, strategists. They memorized the classics, practiced calligraphy, learned which metaphors made which ministers blush. Some wrote their own verses, never under their real names, of course, but you can spot them in the way the voice shifts. One poem, buried inside a male poet's divan, opens with this line. He said my silence was soft, so I gave him a stanza. He couldn't finish. That's not courtly flattery. That's a woman reclaiming the line mid-sentence. Sex story time. There's a tale, passed down in the margins of several texts, about a courtesan who was summoned to entertain a Sufi cleric. Notorious for his public piety and private ... contradictions, she brought no instruments, no wine, no veil. Just a poem, 4 lines. In the first, she described a rosebud. In the second, a hand reaching. In the third, hesitation. And in the fourth, the prayer rug folded, the invitation silent. The cleric reportedly said nothing for an hour, then asked for the poem to be copied. In gold, this wasn't unusual. Courtesans were ghostwriters of the emotional elite. When a prince wanted to impress a rival's wife, he'd commission a poem, but sometimes the courtesan wrote it. When a scholar's lover threatened to leave, he turned to a courtesan not for comfort, but for couplets. And sometimes they left their mark. One line might be repeated across generations, its original author long buried in perfume and scandal. A verse that began as pillow talk ends up quoted at weddings. That's the strange immortality of the courtesan's voice. Fringe. Detail. In a small museum in Tehran, there's a ring said to have belonged to a 17th century poetess, who also served as a courtesan to 3 governors. Inscribed inside, a line of verse, visible only when removed. He read me like scripture, then forgot the ending. The line appears nowhere else, no surviving divan, no attribution, but scholars whisper her name anyway. Because some verses don't need a signature. They just need to land. And what about God? You'd think the courtesan's world would keep the divine at bay. But no. That's the beauty of Persian poetry. It refuses to divide the sacred and the sensual. One courtesan, rumored to be the lover of a philosopher in Shiraz, wrote poems that addressed God like a jealous ex. You watched me kiss him, one line. Reads, and still you sent no sign. Who's unfaithful now? Another, if longing is your lesson, why does he teach it better? You can laugh, but there's pain there. Devotion, the strange intimacy of someone who's prayed with their body and still felt unanswered. Historians still argue whether these poems are spiritual metaphors or just emotional theater, but in the courtesan's voice, the line disappears. Her body is scripture, her silence a supplication. And when she recites a ghazal, she doesn't just interpret it, she inhabits it, makes it tremble, because she knows every word is a double entendre. And she knows you know too. Let's be clear, the courtesan was not a passive muse, she was the author of her own legend. She wore her metaphors like coal and let them blur in the candlelight. She knew that the poem wasn't just something you read, it was something you breathed, whispered, moaned, forgot, then remembered when the scent of a certain spice hit your lungs. She wrote not just for beauty, but to be remembered. Even if they forgot her name, they'd remember the line. And maybe that's what you carry with you now. The knowledge that the most powerful verses aren't the ones carved in stone, but the ones murmured when no one else is listening. The ones that start as seduction and end as scripture. The ones that live in rooms like this, warm with memory, sweet with scandal, echoing with laughter that wasn't meant to last, but did. So when you next read a Persian poem and feel that slight shiver, that wink in the metaphor, that curl in the syntax, ask yourself, whose voice is this? Whose sigh is hiding behind that metaphor? Whose breath warmed the ink? And know that somewhere, a courtesan smiles. You blink, and the lights change. Gone is the low flicker of oil lamps, the scent of cardamom and sweat, the breath-warmed manuscripts. Now it's brass sconces, velvet-bound volumes, a reading room in Victorian England where someone in gloves and mild discomfort is furiously erasing any mention of thighs. Welcome to the era of translation, when Persian poetry crossed into the West and promptly had its teeth filed down, its wine poured out, and its kisses replaced with metaphors from morning dew. Tonight, you're going to meet the translators, the interpreters, the cultural middlemen who, intentionally or not, repackaged the sultrest, most mystically soaked poetry on earth into something a Victorian widow could read during tea. And it's going to make you a little angry, but also fascinated. Because in translation, things aren't just lost. Sometimes they're exposed. Let's start with Sir William Jones, 18th century Orientalist, scholar, man of many languages, and possibly the first British man to blush in Farsi. He adored Persian poetry, said it was superior to Greek, collected manuscripts, translated Hafez, but he also admitted, quite openly, that he had to temper the material. His version of a poem where the beloved's lips drip wine more intoxicating than any vine became, her words soothe the soul as gentle wine soothes the weary traveler. Close, but also no, that's not the same fire. That's not the poem that kept sultans up at night and made Sufis weep into their robes. That's polite. And Persian poetry is many things, but it is never, ever polite. Then came Edward Fitzgerald, the man who made Omar Khayyam a household name in the English-speaking world. His Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam remains a literary sensation, still quoted today, especially by people who haven't read anything else. And yes, it's beautiful, but it's also not Khayyam. It's Khayyam through the filter of Victorian existentialism, atheism, and a hefty pour of red wine. Fitzgerald's Khayyam is a sad drunk, questioning God over a goblet. The real Khayyam? Mathematician, astronomer, possibly an irreverent mystic with a deeply Persian flair for linguistic seduction. One of his original verses, "The shadow of your curl binds my reason." Fitzgerald's version, "Make the most of what we yet may spend." A gorgeous line, but not remotely the same. Historians still argue whether Fitzgerald was translating or remixing, whether he was rescuing Persian poetry from obscurity or rewriting it for Western consumption. The answer is probably both. But what's clear is this: translation wasn't neutral. It was interpretation, sanitization, occasionally accidental sabotage. Some metaphors didn't survive. Others were edited for modesty. One Victorian scholar translating Sadi rewrote a poem about a night spent with the son of a weaver as an evening of philosophical conversation with a youthful companion. You can almost hear the footnote trying not to scream. Sex story buried in ink. There's a rumor never confirmed, always whispered, that one translator of Rumi in the late 19th century privately produced a midnight edition of his translations. Uncensored, annotated, and meant only for elite collectors. In it, the references to Shams were not softened into divine friend, but left in their original intensity. He kissed my mouth and I lost time. Then God arrived. The edition vanished from libraries, rumored to have been burned or locked in private collections. A single surviving page was found in 1923, used as packing material in a crate of Persian tiles. Its margin reads, "2. True to survive." And yet, even with all this censorship, Persian poetry still seduced the West. You can feel it in the way 19th century poets started to adopt the ghazal form, in how American transcendentalists borrowed imagery from Sufi texts, in how slowly but surely lines about curls and wine and sleepless nights started to slip into the polite corridors of English verse. Hafez got invited to dinner parties, Rumi became a guru, and the beloved, still unnamed, still everywhere. Fringe fact: one British librarian in 1910 noted in a private journal that reading Hafez produces in the sensitive reader a sense of intoxication entirely unrelated to the meaning of the words. He described it as a language of ache. And he was right. Even when the metaphors were clipped, the structure, the rhythm, the longing had slipped through. And that's the real secret here. Even when mistranslated, misread, mispackaged, these poems still work. They still reach you. Maybe not in the way the original poet intended, but in a way that matters. You read a softened verse, and something still breaks open. You feel the ache under the grammar, the shimmer beneath the bowdlerized line. Because true poetry, especially Persian poetry, is sneaky. It finds the crack and pours itself in. Still, it's worth asking, what got lost? What didn't cross the language border? Often, the erotic, the queer, the mystical ambiguity, the parts that were too slippery for Western taxonomy. In trying to make the poems understandable, translators stripped away the mystery, the shimmer, the not knowing that made them powerful. They offered answers where there should have been longing. And that's the tragedy, but also the challenge. To read Persian poetry in translation is to know you're only holding a fragment, a shadow, but sometimes even a shadow can show you the shape of a flame dot. So now, as you reread that line, any line, you ask yourself, what else could it mean? What's been hidden? What has the translator made more palatable that was once more painful, more raw, more alive? And as you ask, the poem begins to speak in a new voice. Not the voice of the translator, not even the voice of the poet, but the voice of the ache itself, carried across centuries, through hands, hearts, languages, and into you. You walk through the marketplace of ghosts now, where the dead whisper in calligraphy and the living sell scented candles with Rumi's face. On the label, the air smells like rosewater in capitalism. You've arrived at the afterlife of Persian poetry, the place where verses once, smuggled through censors and scribbled on the edge of midnight, now sparkle on Instagram quotes, pop song lyrics, and overpriced mugs. You weren't planning to come here, but here you are, blinking beneath a neon sign that reads, "Don't grieve. Anything you lose comes round in another form." And you wonder, did Rumi really say that? More importantly, did he say it for this? Welcome to the world of posthumous myth-making, where the poets are immortal, but their meanings, not so much. Let's start with the obvious. Rumi, born in the 13th century, whirled into sainthood, and somewhere along the way, absorbed into the Western self-help industrial complex. In life, he was a scholar, mystic, lover of shams, composer of thousands of lines that swung between erotic collapse and divine union. In death, he became a brand. Today, his verses get plastered on yoga studio walls, quoted at tech conferences, and whispered by influencers who've never touched a gazelle but love the vibes. You've seen it. You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean. In a drop, is it poetic? Sure. Is it him? Maybe. Historians still argue whether that quote was a translation, a paraphrase, or just someone's journal entry that got misattributed. And this isn't about purity or gatekeeping. It's about what happens when mysticism becomes merchandise. When the longing that once tore through robes and reputations gets flattened into motivational slogans. A poem once dangerous enough to be memorized in secret now prints on birthday cards. A line once written for a beloved whose name could never be spoken now serenades almond milk commercials. The ache has been aestheticized. Let's talk Hafez, the wild-tongued flirt of Shiraz. In Iran, his divan is still used for divination. You open a page at random and read your fate. But outside, especially in English, his fire often gets cooled. A line like, "I am the slave of the moon-faced one," becomes, "My love is loyal and true." Where's the danger? The whine? The trembling? The implication that love might kill you, and that you would ask for it anyway. Gone, softened, prettified. Made safe for mass consumption. One translator in the 20th century famously said of Hafez, "We must preserve the spirit, not the letter." Which is fine until the spirit starts to resemble a smiling emoji rather than a wine-drenched mystic yelling at the stars. A verse that once got poets exiled now comforts CEOs on lunch breaks. A line once whispered by a concubine in a mirror-lit room now floats beside bubble bath bottles. The poetry survived, but the teeth? The teeth got polished away. Fringe fact, in 2005, a major cosmetics brand launched a fragrance called Beloved's Breath, marketed using what they claimed were Sufi verses about divine scent. One of the lines quoted on the bottle, "She walked past me and God forgot my name," wasn't Persian. It was written by a Canadian advertising executive who channeled the spirit of Hafez during a meditation retreat. When asked why he attributed it to Hafez, he replied, "It felt right." Scholars still debate whether to laugh or cry, and it's not just about misattribution, it's about context. Persian poetry wasn't written for comfort, it was written for rupture. For longing so sharp it made people faint. For metaphors so layered they got poets killed. When those lines are stripped from their context, ripped from the garden, the bathhouse, the prayer mat, and turned into hashtags, something essential is lost. Not the beauty, that stays, but the danger, the grit, the pulse that says, "I wrote this with trembling hands." Of course, there's another side. This popularization, even in its diluted form, keeps the poetry alive. It introduces people to something they might otherwise never read. A teenager who sees a Rumi quote on Pinterest might one day find herself reading the Masnavi. A lonely, soul-googling love quotes might stumble into a ghazal and feel, for the first time, understood. There's magic in that. Echoes still matter, even the misquoted ones, but it raises a haunting question. What happens when the echo becomes louder than the original voice? When the memory of the poem replaces its reality? When longing becomes aesthetic and the beloved is just another lifestyle brand? We see it happen everywhere, on coffee mugs, on wellness blogs, on self-love manifestos dressed up in verses once soaked with sweat and prayer. The poems live on, but sometimes they forget what they were aching for. Sex Story, Tangled in Legacy, one of the most heavily censored poems of the 16th century, written by a court poet whose name is still debated, described a dream encounter with the beloved that ended in a single, devastating image. Her scent lingered on my prayer beads, and I could not pray without blushing. The poem was banned. The poet was exiled. Today, a sanitized version of that line appears on bookmarks sold at airport gift shops. It reads, "Love leaves traces in sacred places. Lovely. Harmless. Utterly defanged. And yet, when you read the original, something inside you stirs. You feel the heat, the danger, the desperate hope that someone, anyone, will understand. That is the real legacy, not the merchandise, not the mistranslation, but the feeling that survives despite them. So, what do we do with this tension? Do we gatekeep? Burn the mugs? Delete the hashtags? Maybe not. But we do remember. We remember that Persian poetry wasn't built to soothe. It was built to seduce, provoke, transform. That the best lines were written in risk. That when a poet whispered, "I lost God in your mouth," they weren't aiming for viral content. They were documenting spiritual collapse, and maybe that's what you carry forward. Not just the line, but the weight behind it. Not just the quote, but the night it was written. The body it was written for, the risk it carried, the truth it almost told, because the poets are still here, beneath the noise, still whispering, still burning, still asking, do you feel it yet? Do you remember what longing is supposed to taste like? You're standing on a balcony now, barefoot, with dawn just threatening the edge of the sky, and everything around you feels suspiciously calm. A crow calls from a rooftop. Someone lights incense downstairs. But inside, your chest hums with static. You've come so far from perfumed gardens to candlelit libraries, from scandalous verses to star-charted lust, and now you're seeing something strange. Familiar lines, familiar names, but the tone is different, polished, minimal. Possibly tagged with hashtag divine feminine or hashtag soul awakening. Welcome to the now. This is where mysticism has been rebranded, where centuries of Persian poetry float through a world of phone screens and filtered self-discovery. It's beautiful, it's weird, and it's deeply confusing. Because somehow the mysticism that once got poets exiled is now being quoted beneath yoga poses and sold in self-help manuals, promising inner peace in 5 bullet points. Mysticism went mainstream, but what did it lose on the way? Let's start with the familiar players. Rumi, of course, stands at the center still spinning, but now he's spinning on coffee mugs, in influencer bios, across sunset Instagram posts tagged hashtag stay wild. You've seen the quotes. The wound is the place where the light enters you. What you seek is seeking you. But if you trace those words backward, if you follow them through their roots, their rhythms, their original contexts, what you find isn't a feel-good mantra. You find a man devastated by longing. You find grief. You find divine obsession clawing its way through language. And yet here now, those same lines function more like band-aids, gentle, marketable, optimized for likes. And the irony? Persian mystics never sought comfort. They weren't telling you how to feel better. They were inviting you to feel more. They wanted you cracked open, sobbing, uncertain, unmoored. Rumi didn't write for the wellness industry. He wrote for those who'd fallen so deeply into desire that the only direction left was God or madness. His verses weren't cozy. They were seismic. So when they're reduced to pastel affirmations, something ancient starts to tremble. Fringe fact, there's an entire industry spanning publishing, wellness, and spirituality that now revolves around curated Rumi experiences. Meditation, retreats in Bali, Sufi dance workshops taught by people who've never touched a masnavi, even AI-generated Rumi quotes, which cobble together vaguely poetic language and sprinkle in words like soul, light, and beloved. One such quote reads, "Enter the garden of your inner whisper and become the ocean." Lovely, but it's gibberish. And yet, thousands of people reposted it, believing it to be authentic. Because the mystic brand is strong. Too strong, maybe. Strong enough to outshine the real voice beneath Dot, and Rumi isn't alone. Hafez has been turned into a kind of metaphysical oracle. In Iran, people still use his divan for divination. Yes, but outside. He's often distilled into generic, follow your bliss slogans. One Western anthology translated a fiery erotic line about wine and the curve of a beloved's shoulder into seek the joy of the heart, and all will follow. It's not wrong, it's just empty. The longing's been bleached out. The double meanings? Flattened. The danger? Gone. Historians still argue whether this cultural repackaging is a betrayal or a necessary adaptation. Some say it's just what happens when poetry crosses time and borders. Others say it's the soft death of something once sharp. And you? You stand between those arguments, holding a line that once meant something more, feeling how thin it's become, and wondering if the poet would recognize it anymore. Let's talk about hashtags. Hashtag Sufi wisdom. Hashtag RUM I love. Hashtag Persian poetry. Scroll through any of them, and you'll see a curious thing, quotes often disconnected from their source, stripped of context, but deeply beloved. They float like spiritual confetti, providing moments of calm in chaotic feeds, and for some readers that's enough. A glimpse, a comfort, a breath of something older. But for others, maybe for you, it's not enough. Because you know what's missing. You've been through the back rooms, the bathhouses, the heartbreaks. You've seen how those poems were born under pressure, through longing, in moments of unspeakable vulnerability. You've read the verses that bled. And now, seeing them turned into typography on rose-pink backgrounds feels thin. Sex Story. Modern Echo Edition. In a recent anthology of love poems from across the world, one entry claimed to be from a 13th century Persian mystic. The poem describes a spiritual touch so transcendent that my spine sang and the stars blinked. Twice. It was beautiful. It was also fake. Reverse text search found no Persian equivalent. Likely, it was written by the editor. But it sold. The anthology topped charts. And in one review, a reader wrote, "I read this when I was going through a breakup. It healed me. And that's the thing. Even misattributed mysticism still touches people. It's not about fact. It's about feeling." Still somewhere, a poet groans. And then there's the merch. T-shirts, crystal kits, journals with fake gazelles printed inside. One candle brand markets a scent called Divine Ache, supposedly inspired by Rumi, with notes of sandalwood, saffron, and the echo of a lost kiss. You want to laugh. You want to scream. You want to buy it, just to see if it smells like anything remotely poetic. But mostly, you feel something else. Nostalgia for the real. For the messy, risky, sweaty mysticism that didn't sell anything but told the truth anyway. Because mysticism, real mysticism, wasn't clean. It was full of contradictions. Of lust mistaken for prayer. Of prayer interrupted by a memory of skin. of verses written while fasting, dreaming of mouths. And when that mysticism goes mainstream, those contradictions are often scrubbed away. You're left with clarity, but no ache. Insight, but no sweat. Poetry, but no beloved dot. So where does that leave you? Floating between two worlds. One of curated spiritual quotes and filtered longing. The other, dense with metaphor, hard to translate, slippery with meaning. But maybe that's the real mystic test. Can you hold both? Can you appreciate the echo while still yearning for the original voice? Can you love the quote on a tote bag and still hunt down the manuscript that birthed it? Because maybe the answer isn't to dismiss the modern wave, but to deepen it. To trace the line back to its root. To read not just the quote, but the verse before it, the metaphor behind it, the ache beneath it. To remember that what you're reading was once dangerous, once sacred, once whispered between lovers who weren't allowed to speak aloud. And maybe, in doing that, you bring the poetry back to life. You let it breathe again. You remind it of what it used to be. Not just pretty, not just wise, but wild, hungry, holy. And yours, you're lying in a room that doesn't exist anymore. The walls are made of memory. The air is thick with ink and incense. And right now, right here, the poets are gathering. Rumi is spinning in the corner, his robe a blur of longing. Hafez is leaning against a broken arch, sipping something forbidden, and smiling like he's just overheard your last secret. Mahastis. Earrings glint in the candlelight, and Rabia is barefoot on the carpet, carving couplets into the air with her hands. You didn't know it, but this is where you were always going, to the end of the labyrinth, to the final stanza. And there, all waiting to ask you the same question, now that you've felt it. What will you do with the ache? Because that's what it is, isn't it? Not a lesson, not a history, not a tidy answer wrapped in metaphor, but an ache. The poets called it ishq, not just love, not romance, but an all-consuming fire that eats. The self, the beloved, the entire world. And they spent their lives trying to name it, not tame it, never that, but to give it shape, to make it sing. And in doing so, they left you this inheritance of heat and hunger, verses that burn long after the page is closed. Let's rewind for a second. Remember how this began? With a garden, with a glance, with metaphors that curled, like smoke around hips and holy names. And now you've walked through centuries of it, ghazals that seduced, masnavis that devoured, verses written in blood, ink, sweat, silence. You've met mystics who kissed God through poetry, and lovers who kissed poetry into God. You've seen how longing could be sacred, how absence could be erotic, how desire, when held long enough, becomes a kind of prayer. And in all of it, one truth kept pulsing like a vein beneath the skin. Persian poetry was never really about answers. It was about transformation. About what happens when you look too long at the moon and forget your own name. About what happens when you hear a voice in a verse and realize it's yours. About how the ache itself becomes the doorway. Let's end with one last sex story, because it wouldn't be fair to leave you without a final flame. In a crumbling collection from the late 1600s, there's a masnavi written by an anonymous court poet, smuggled out of Isfahan and nearly lost in a fire. It tells the story of a scribe who falls in love with his master's son. Forbidden, of course, dangerous, but the scribe writes him love poems anyway, carefully, secretly tucking them into books, hiding them behind bindings, writing one in lemon juice so it could only be read by candle heat. One night, the son finds a verse that reads, "I have prayed in your shadow so long, I no longer recognize the light." No response. Days pass. Then, on the last page of a worn astronomy manual, the son writes back, "If I am the moon, it's only because your fire lit me." They meet. They don't touch. They never kiss. But every night after, they write each other into infinity. And when the scribe is caught and exiled, He takes nothing with him except a book of blank pages. Waiting, historians still argue whether the poem is real or apocryphal. Whether it was written by a man, a woman, a lover, a monk. But does it matter? The ache is real. The echo is real. And that's what survives. Fringe fact to end it all. In 2017, a group of Iranian students used AI to reconstruct lost Persian poems based on fragmentary verses. The computer generated ghazals that made older scholars weep. One line read, "You left me in silence, so I made a palace out of echo." The students said they didn't care whether the lines were real. They felt real. And maybe that's what poetry is now, not just a record of longing, but its continuation. So you sit in this imaginary room with the poets watching, and you realize they were never just writing to lovers, to God, to each other. They were writing to you. They were lighting candles along a path that winds through gardens and prisons, kisses and prayers, until it arrives right here. Right now, where you decide what kind of lover you'll be. Will you repeat their lines? Will you write your own? Will you chase the ache or try to forget it? Will you let the metaphors wrap around your breath and lead you somewhere dangerous, beautiful, unfinished? You already know the answer. You wouldn't be here if you didn single quotes t.now. Let it all soften. Let the voices dim, one by one, like lamps in a long hallway. Let the scent of the jasmine curl around your thoughts and slip out the window into the night. The garden fades, the lovers grow still, the pages close themselves, and all that remains is breath, steady, slow. You don't need to remember every name, every verse, every metaphor. Just the feeling. The way your chest stretched open. The way the poems curled under your ribs and whispered, "Yes, you." Still. Let that stay. Let it settle. The ache isn't gone, it's just asleep now. Curled into a corner of your dreams, waiting for another night. Another poem. Another you. End of script. Sweet dreams.